Welcome, everyone, to the September 2024 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. My name is Judy Flattery. HSSB is a 501c3 nonprofit, 100% run by volunteers, founded in the mid-90s with about 105 members, and we always welcome new members. We appreciate our members so much. It's their dues and donations that make it possible for us to provide these free meetings and services in the Central Coast of California and stretching across the country and across the world. We welcome dues and donations. Love to have you as a member or volunteering your talents to help us expand what we're able to do. Today, special treat, we have one of our board members, Gary Noreen, speaking about the coming population collapse, what it is, why it's happening, and options to address it. Gary is a retired systems architect at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. As I mentioned, he's a member of our board. He's responsible for our excursions and took us on a particularly wonderful excursion to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory earlier this year. He's a futurist. He's a technology optimist. He follows breakthroughs in science and biotech, advanced energy, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicle, electric vehicles, and nanotechnology. He came from the humanist group in Ventura and joined us a year or two ago. He lives in Oxnard Shores with his wife, Zena Kingshill. They are frequent world travelers, and he volunteered to share with us his particular interest in this topic. And thank you, Gary, for being willing to share your thoughts with us today.
So there's been a flurry of news articles in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, and other legitimate media about falling fertility rates and population collapse. It's become a major issue within this Republican Party. Why is there so much interest in this now? Is it a real problem? If so, what can be done about it? Well, I'm going to start by showing you a slide that represents what people have thought about where population was going in the past. So this is a slide from a UN report in 2022 projecting where they thought population was going and where it had been. So on the left, up to year 2022, the purple line indicates what the past data is, and everything to the right of that are projections beyond 2022. You can see they have what they call a high fertility ratio scenario, which basically would be continuing population increases at the same rate as in the past. In the middle is one that plateaus out with a 95 percentile wings on it. That is 95% of the cases that they studied would be either above, as shown in that gray purple area. And then the middle is sort of plateaus out, and that's apparently the 50% point. So there's a 50% chance it will be above that, 50% chance it'll be below that. And looking at that, you would think, really, there's not a problem. So this is what the CNN reporting on this said about it. By 2080, the world's population is expected to peak at 10.4 billion. Then there's a 50% chance that the population will plateau or begin to decrease by 2100. So big deal, it doesn't look like much of a problem. So I didn't really think of it as much of a problem up until a year later. But what happened in the meantime is Elon Musk started tweeting about this in 2022. Now remember, the report came out in 2022, and the report says it doesn't look like there's a problem. And Elon Musk is saying that now that population collapse due to low birth rate is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. So he's raising a lot of alarm. There were multiple tweets to this effect in 2022. And I started noticing, and here's the response of the media at the time. CNN said demographers say it's not happening, referring to Elon's statements. And Wired magazine piped in and saying Elon Musk is totally wrong about population collapse. So there were people dissenting from his point of view. And what happened in 2023, a year ago this month, September 2023, an article came out in the New York Times by Dean Spears, an economist from Texas named Dean Spears, and graphics by Sarah Chodash. I mentioned the graphics because the graphics were spectacular. This was just an amazing article. I was really struck by it. It's sort of a change your life article. When you read through it, you think, wow, things are really different than I thought. And so I'm going to walk through two of the slides from that article and explain what's going on and why there's concern. And I should say parenthetically that it turns out that Dean Spears, the author, works for an organization that received funding from Elon Musk. So there was actually a tie there. I'm not a fan of Elon Musk. I had reserved a Cybertruck, and when he bought X, I immediately canceled my order. That's my attitude towards Elon Musk. I respect what he's done with SpaceX and Tesla, and I'll talk more about that later. But I would not trust him on anything. So I would not take his word on anything. Anyway, so here's what the opening graphic of the article shows. We're now at 8 billion people in 2022. And this is generally agreed to. He actually used the same UN statistics that were in that UN report from which the first slide was taken. But that ended at 2100, and apparently that is what demographers typically did at that point. What he did is he projected various scenarios for what would happen past that point. And if the whole world had the fertility rate of the United States today, that's what's shown in the darker red line, the bold red line. That's what would happen. That fertility rate of the US today is 1.8. Now, replacement level is generally regarded to be 2.1. You need to have an average of 2.1 people per female born in order to maintain a constant population. So the US is a bit below that, and even though it doesn't look like it's that far below it, over a long period of time, it looks like a collapse. Now, this chart is on a much longer timeline than the previous chart. You can see on the far left, it starts at 1000 BC, and the point at which there are 10 billion people is 3085 years later in 2085. So that's a pretty long timeline. And later on, we're going to take a much closer look at what's occurring in the relatively near future in South Korea in particular, just to understand what's happening. So that does look like a collapse in that sense. So it does look like serious. What's much more serious is what's shown in the next slide. Most demographers have only actually looked to 2100. They haven't generally looked beyond that. So this was not a commonly looked at problem. What this just shows that if the US maintained the same fertility rate, then sometime between the 22nd and 23rd century, in other words, 100 years from now, the decline could look as steep as the increase that we've had just before that, which was pretty steep, as you can see, although it is a long time scale. So I'm going to switch out of my presentation. We're actually going to look at the New York Times directly so I can show you the graphics. So what this shows is fertility rate. Now, once again, fertility rate is the number of children born to each woman on average. And this is shown right now in 1991 for countries with at least 1 million people. Now, if I hover my cursor over a dot, I see what country is associated with that dot and what their GDP per capita was. The bottom line shows per capita income, gross domestic product per capita. And then in 2022, I see the gross domestic product for that year. And then below at the bottom, we see fertility rate. And you can see in the case of Niger, which had the highest fertility rate of any of these countries, it was 7.8 in 1991 and 6.8 in 2021. So it's decreasing. And we don't have time to go through all of these, but I want to say in general point, look at a few of these. You see all the ones up here are in Africa. And the ones down here are generally Europe, Japan, and some outlying countries, South Korea. Russia actually is down here, pretty low fertility rate already in 1991 and 1.5 now. So let's see what happens, what the difference is between 2021. Now, remember what it looks like right now. 2021, what we see are the tails were where it was in 1991, and the heads, the dots, are where fertility rate is in 2021. And look at that. They're all going down, except for two. Going down means that their fertility rate is decreasing. The larger the tail, the more it's been decreasing. So here's an interesting case. Here's one where the gross domestic product was already quite high. It's actually decreased a little bit, but the fertility rate has gone from 5.7 to 2.4. That's Saudi Arabia, not surprisingly. Over here is one where the income went down and still fertility rate went down quite a bit. So it's not directly tied to gross domestic product. It's going down everywhere, regardless of that. There's two countries that are outliers. Kazakhstan, where it actually went up from 2.7 to 3.1, and Romania, which is very hard to find, but right there, Romania went up slightly from 1.6 to 1.7. That's it. All the other ones, it's been going down. And here's South Korea, which is a key country to consider here because it's gotten the lowest at this point, which was 1.7 in 1991 and 2021, 0.88. And I'm going to be talking about South Korea in depth because I think it's a forerunner of what can be expected elsewhere. Okay, this shows the fertility rate as a function of time from 1950 to 2020, and that's about the best I've been able to do in terms of going back in time. It's kind of hard to get good data that tells you very much beyond that. But what's really interesting here is look at the United States and South Korea. This is the fertility rate versus time from 1950 to 2020. What do you think happened here? The late 50s? This is the baby boomlet from the Korean War, which was very significant in the United States, but far more significant in Korea. And look what's happened ever since then in Korea. Very dramatic drop at a very high rate. US, we had a bit of a drop, leveled out a bit, but it's been coming down again. So this shows a few African nations that pointed out. Here's Niger. Even Niger, look at that rate. It's declining now. It's actually a pretty high rate of decline. Nigeria, other African countries are also coming down. When I first talked to people about that, nobody seemed to believe that it's actually the rates are coming down in Africa, but they are. And I think that can be expected to continue. This shows a world rate starting at 5 in 1950 and being cut in half by 2020. US is down here. It's 1.8 now. South Korea is actually 0.72 in 2023. So it's accelerated in North Korea. The decline is actually accelerating. I've got 3 quotes here from a paper named at the bottom. The real reason people aren't having kids, it's a need government subsidies and better family policy can't necessarily address, by Christine Emba in The Atlantic. She interviewed a number of people about why they are or are not having families. And we have more quotes from her later on. This is some of the background that she gave. And this first statistic on top was the one that scared me the most of all the statistics I've read so far. I've read a number of reports. This scares me the most. The share of American adults younger than 50 who say they are unlikely to ever have children rose 10 percentage points between 2018 and 2023 to 14%. Okay, that's in 5 years. It went from 37% to 47% of the people in the US who were of basically childbearing age saying that it was unlikely that they were ever going to have kids. Okay, if you take half the people out of the population and say they're not going to have kids, that means to maintain the 2.1 fertility rate, you're going to have an average of four kids per person for the remaining 50% or so. So that's a really serious problem. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Another interesting one, that every OECD country except Israel has a below replacement fertility rate, and the speed of the decline during the past decade has outpaced demographers' expectations. So it's getting worse. So it's now 0.72 for South Korea, and there's no reason to expect it's going to stay there. The momentum is going down, as for in other countries. And I think there are reasons for that, and we'll get to that. So the average rate in the European Union countries was 1.46. That's substantially below the US. The US is 1.8. We're actually in much better shape than most other countries for various reasons, as usual. on this score. I'm actually much more concerned about other countries. So how do we get there? Well, I like to go back to the beginning, think of why did we have such a high fertility rate in the first place? How did that happen? It's from millions of years of evolution by sexual reproduction and natural selection. Humans evolved to reproduce enough children to grow the species. Human brains, our hormonal systems, our bodies evolved to maximize the number of children who could also reproduce. What feels good evolved in the same way, in particular, sexual reproduction. It feels good to do what causes babies to be born, and so people are very strongly inclined to do that, whether they like it or not in many cases. And at the same time, religions, cultures, and beliefs also evolved. Those that did not result in having people that reproduce became extinct cultures. Pronatalist policies like be fruitful and multiply helped. Cultures that followed that prescription succeeded. Okay, so what happened? I'd like to look at contraception and the timing of it. Before 1960, there were contraceptives, basically condoms, but they apparently weren't terribly effective. I don't know exactly why. But in 1960 and 1970, when the first oral contraceptive was approved and then IUDs, contraception became much more effective. As a result, babies became an option. So babies have become optional since 1960, the way I look at this. So Elon had a colorful way of putting it. Once you have birth control and abortions and whatnot, now you can still satisfy the limbic instinct, but not procreate. What's happening is that without convincing personal reasons for individuals to reproduce, they are increasingly deciding not to. And the end result of all that is extinction. That's what Musk is talking about. Here, an example of how that happens. This is an article that appeared earlier this month in the New York Times saying that there are only 2 Shakers left. Now, I assume most of you have heard of Shakers before. It's a religion that practices chastity. No, they don't have any children. They exist solely by conversion. And they're down to 2 people. And here's what happens, as Elon says. Will civilization end with a bang or a whimper? Well, it's currently trying to end with a whimper in adult diapers, which is depressing as hell. And that's what's going on with the Shakers now. So why is the fertility rate declining? I don't have a lot of statistics behind this, but there seems to be general agreement in most of the articles I've seen about this. I'm presenting a number of them. I'm sure you can come up with a lot more. It turns out there are a lot of reasons why not to have kids. And if it becomes an option, it's easy to avoid doing it. And the first one, key one, is effective birth control now, so that having babies is an option. Children are more expensive than they've been in the past. There's a high cost of childcare, education, parents' time, I consider a cost, housing, getting some people to help you out with them is becoming increasingly expensive and difficult. Now, instead of expecting children to take care of them in their old age and wanting to raise children to make sure that that happens, they realize they'd be better off accumulating wealth and living off the proceeds of that wealth. Changing women's roles. The feminist revolutions across the world in which women prioritize career before childbirth or instead of childbirth. Many women wait to conceive until after their education is completed and their career has been established. And that often ends up being too late, and certainly too late to have very many children. Unable to find a compatible partner. I hear about this a lot. My own daughter had difficulty with that. She is married now, but late. Anxieties, lots of anxieties that people have about having children, which also can result in them deciding to wait on a decision, which eventually means there's a no decision, which means no birth. Overpopulation, concerns about overpopulation, concerns about climate, not wanting to bring a child into a world where the climate change is resulting in large problems now. The birthing process. I have a niece that says she doesn't want to have children because she's watched too many episodes of Call the Midwife with her mom and sees how terrifying it is and how all the terrible things that can go wrong. Genetic defects. The same niece also is concerned because she has a brother who is autistic and she doesn't want to raise an autistic child. These are understandable. There are all kinds of other genetic defects that they worry about. I'm just saying that you hear this a lot and it's a real thing. They're concerned about body changes that happen when they become mother. You get very big and fat, and then flab comes, and all kinds of cosmetic changes that they are concerned about. And so, with all these things you're worrying about, the inclination is to wait or not to make a positive decision that having a child now is. Young adults see families that don't have kids and families that do have kids, and they decide that they'd be better off without. Their life would be easier, and it likely is. Current culture actually frowns on large families. I've seen reports of people who have interviewed women with large families, and they say, well, when they go to the playground or other social functions, people seem to consider them as taking too many resources, and that they're taking more than their share because they have large families. Here I'm pointing at us, I think, at some of us at least, growing population of nuns who have no be fruitful and multiply dogma and belief. We don't have that Christian belief. Now, there are a lot of people are moving away from Christianity to disbelief, but they then think differently about having kids. And what I've seen from a number of reports is that women with large families, 5 or more kids, say that they view it as something they're doing for God. And I don't really understand that kind of thinking, but it seems to be effective. Maybe there's something we have to come up with as an alternative to that. Okay, now I'm back to that article I mentioned earlier, the real reason people aren't having kids. And I found one quote in it that I thought was particularly relevant. It says, many in the current generation of young adults don't seem totally convinced of their own purpose, of the purpose of humanity at large, let alone that of a child. It may be that for many people, absent the clear sense of meaning, the perceived challenges of having children outweigh any subsidy the government might offer. She was actually quoting from a couple of books that came out recently where they interviewed large numbers of women, and they told the reasons why they would or would not want to have babies. Something that's come up in some of the right-wing thinkers about this, conservative Catholics in particular, is something called telos, where telos is derived from the ancient Greek term for purpose or end, or sort of what's the purpose of life. In the Christian context, it refers to God's ultimate plan and purpose for humanity. I copied that from a Catholic church website. I found out that Epicurus actually wrote a fair amount about telos from the Epicurean point of view, and he says pleasure is the telos. That's the purpose. Well, if pleasure is the purpose or happiness, that doesn't necessarily lead to more kids if you have the option not to have them. And a lot of Western thought comes from the Epicureans. The Declaration of Independence, for example, the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence came from Thomas Jefferson, who was a follower of the Epicureans. They were been very influential. And when you go back and look at the reasons why people are not having kids, most of them relate to, well, it won't make me happy. And so it's really very personal. They're giving personal reasons, but they have all these personal reasons why it's going to be difficult for them. It's not going to make me feel better to have kids, and for that reason, I'm not going to have them. What you really need to have is we need to find a higher purpose or reason why people want to have kids, or see how we can help them. So what I've been wondering is what would be a successful humanist telos that would be pro-natalist, that says, well, here are reasons why you should have children from our perspective, that we can talk about that later. I want to address the overpopulation anxiety a bit, because that's used by a lot of people. Climate change also. I'm not going to get into climate change because that would be a whole another presentation. But overpopulation I can address quickly. In the 1960s, Paul Ehrlich predicted that overpopulation would lead to mass starvation and death due to insufficient resources. Those predictions did not come true. I did some searches, and everybody agrees that they didn't come true, and that, in fact, the resource problem is really not that big a problem. I have a couple of other charts that address that a bit further. Are we actually running out of resources? So this shows resources between 1980 and 2016 in nominal prices in the green line, in real prices adjusted for inflation in the sort of orange line, and the blue line at bottom in what they call time prices, which I think is a good way of looking at, probably the best way of looking at it. The amount of time that you would spend to pay for a particular commodity, a certain amount of a certain commodity, out of this basket of 50 global commodities that are considered in this chart. And you can see it's actually been coming down while the population has been increasing. It's because we find better ways of extracting things, we find alternative sources, we find alternative ways of satisfying resource needs, we innovate, and that has actually come down over time. So that's not such a serious problem at this point. Another slide addressing that is the reduction in poverty from 1800 to 2017. This chart shows the share of humanity living on less than $2 a day in constant dollars. I don't know if this is $2. I don't think this is $2 a day in 1800. I don't know what it was, but basically constant dollars. And 85% lived in poverty in 1800 by this measure, whereas only 9% live in poverty today. It's been constantly going down around the world. So the shortages are just not a convincing problem so far as I can see. Now I want to talk about South Korea by look at this one country to show how bad it's gotten and what the effects of that will be. Rather than looking at every individual country, I think since countries are heading in the direction of South Korea, you get the idea. So in this chart, which I put this together, so that's why it's unreadable. I apologize for that. It shows that where it says generation zero, that's not births, that's actually the starting population side. That's the current population of South Korea. And what I did is I said, okay, given a fertility rate of 0.72 and assuming generations are separated by 30 years, what are the number of births that each succeeding generation would have? So I look at the births from the preceding generation and I reduce that based upon the 0.72 fertility rate. And that basically results a little bit more than 1/3 of the number of people in the next generation. Because at 0.66, it would be exactly 1/3. But at 0.72, it's a little bit above that. So you can see in the first case, going from 51,630,000 as a starting population, the next generation has 18,586,800. So that's almost down by a third. The next generation is down by almost another third. Look how rapidly it comes down. In 1, 2, 3, the fourth generation, it's under 1 million total. So this is very, very dramatic reduction. This shows the years separating the total number of years from the start. So in 100 years, you're down to less than 1 million after 100, somewhere in there, which is just a very, very dramatic reduction. And just think of all the consequences of that. I think of how what's happening in Korea is personally going to affect me. I love K-drama. They're known for K-pop. This is a very successful country which produces a huge number of products and services. My 91-inch TV came from South Korea. They won't be able to do that stuff if their population decreases this rapidly, and they know it. And they'll have all kinds of other problems. Who's going to take care of the older Koreans? There's all kinds of things we'll get into later in more detail, but you can see how dramatic this is. Now, they're not dumb, and the South Koreans are not dumb. They're very smart, or they wouldn't have been so successful. So why aren't they, what are they doing about this? Well, they've spent more than $200 billion over the past 16 years on policies meant to boost fertility, including monthly stipends for parents, expanded parental leave, and subsidized prenatal care. Yet its total fertility rate fell by 25% in that time. And this is something that turns out is happening everywhere. There are a lot of other countries that have been looking at similar problems and been trying to counter it by subsidizing families. The Nordic countries, Sweden in particular, has tried this with little effect. Hungary's tried this, China, Singapore. Just about every country that's tried it has only seen marginal improvements, nothing very significant so far. And so that's of great concern. And one of the reasons why people are so concerned about it. It's looking like it's a hard problem to try to solve, how to get that fertility rate back up again to a level that's not going to be extremely disruptive of society. Korea is going even further. In 2019, there was a radical feminist movement in Korea that came up with a pledge, a vow, called the 4B movement. And the vow is that they would have no sex with men, no giving birth, no dating men, and no marriage with men. And I gather this is because they feel that the South Korean men do not treat them very well. And apparently they have good reason to believe that. And apparently it's actually a reflection of the Me Too movement in the United States. And apparently it's expanding elsewhere. This is being picked up by people in other countries that are talking about doing the same thing. What I'm trying to figure out is how do we switch things around? Now, I'd like to also point out the autocracies because they talk about what superior systems they are to the US, and their fertility rates don't reflect that. China, of course, was already low, just replacement value in 1991. 30 years later, it's down to 1.2. They removed the no child policy. They're actually actively promoting having more children, and it's not having an effect. For the same reasons as elsewhere, it turns out it's very expensive to have a child in China, to get them educated, to get a housing that's sufficient for them, all the other reasons. It can be difficult for their career. Russia went from 1.7 to 1.5. Hungary, which has done a lot, is still going down. Even North Korea is going down, but they're not going down as rapidly as South Korea. So one of the serious problems, if you start having rapid declines in population, is you become vulnerable to invasion. At some point, the North Koreans are just going to be able to walk in to South Korea. I wanted to look at Russia a little bit more because there's an interesting article in the Washington Post recently looked at what's going on with regard to the same issue in Russia. It lost on the order of 1 million people from the war on Ukraine. People are fleeing Russia to get away from Putin, and they're being killed. So it looks bad for Russia. So, and they know this. So Putin is telling them they need to forego education and careers and prioritize having many children. How would that go over here? Putin urges women to start families at 18. And finally, here's a statement from Putin I will read in full. Many of our grandmothers and great-grandmothers had 7 or 8 children, and maybe even more. We should preserve and revive these wonderful traditions. That's a direct quote from Putin. And he's also giving out awards to women that have 10 or more children. So that's what Russia is doing about this. What are the consequences of population decline? Well, first of all, there's a decline in services and infrastructure. There won't be so many restaurants around. There won't be so many of all other services around. They start going out of business. There won't be as many hospitals. There won't be as many doctors. There won't be as much infrastructure. Trying to maintain infrastructure built for 50 million when there are only 1 million, that's a pretty pretty difficult thing to do. A rise in dependency ratio is one of the first things that happens that is a concern already here in the United States, and certainly is a problem everywhere else, where you end up having a crisis in end of life care for the elderly because the elderly are being supported by a dramatically reduced number of people that would have been paying in the past for their care. Difficulties in funding entitlement programs or the number of programs. How about NASA, for example, which I came from? When you have a much smaller tax base, a lot less gets done. Decline in military strength, as I mentioned before, that's a pretty obvious one. Decline in innovation. This is actually very important to me. I will outline in a few minutes some of the advantages that I think that we've had coming out of having a large population in technology, for example. I think that simply the fact we have so many people is one of the reasons there's been such an acceleration of discoveries, revolutionary developments in technology over the past few decades. So I like to pull out stories. I'm just going to show the headline of this one. Young Americans can't keep funding boomers and beyond. And if you actually read this story from the New York Times, September 1 of this month, it does talk about the problem that we just are getting not enough people to take care of us being born. That's where immigration is a big help, obviously, but that's not politically correct now. Here's what I thought was an interesting article. I'm from Ventura County. I get the Ventura County Star, and I've heard about this closure, saw this closure also this month of the Santa Paula birth unit. Santa Paula is sort of a rural area within Ventura County. And the reason they have a problem is because births at the hospital have fallen from 502 deliveries in 2010 to 167 in 2023. That's down by two-thirds in 13 years. So that's very dramatic. There are other problems with schools. Schools are facing declining populations. Colleges are closing. Schools are closing. And that's all happening now because the number of people being born is already so low. And it's become a political issue, an election issue within this presidential election. And J.D. Vance has been saying a particularly notable amount of statements about it. And I'm going to present this. I meant to give you a warning early on that I'm hoping you're free thinkers and don't get immediately completely turned off by the fact that this is J.D. Vance, because some of what he says actually strikes me as suggestions that might lead somewhere. So I'm not totally negative against these, and please don't turn me off yet. So in the first statement, he says, our people aren't having enough children to replace themselves. That should bother us. Now, in the J.D. Vance context, that means white Christian nationalists aren't having enough children. But if you remove the word our, I'm also concerned about that we aren't having enough children to replace us, and that does bother me. He suggested the parents pay less taxes than non-parents. Well, that's effectively what the Democratic family tax credit would have done that he voted against, but he is suggesting that kind of thing. I think that was certainly something we could support. People without kids should face the consequences and the reality, he says, which is a punitive measure, but I do think it's true that parents that are having kids in this environment are doing something good for society, and we need to help them out. He proposed that parents get additional votes on their children's behalf. Well, right now, the population that actually votes is very heavily seniors. And so the younger people, and in particular parents, don't get, I think they do get underrepresented. So I think this might actually be a not terrible suggestion, but we can talk about that when we get to the question and answer period. I won't get into cat ladies. That's too dangerous. But I wanted to make a statement about why I think there are benefits from having a large population, because a lot of people think, well, automatically it's going to be a lot better if we have a much smaller population. And I just look at what we've accomplished, where we're at today. We live way better than anybody in history, way better than any kings or queens in history. It just really astounds me how much better off we are than anybody else in our past. We have virtually unlimited instantaneous access to vast amounts of information and entertainment around the world. And just think what if we lose South Korea, we lose everything from Japan because they go down almost as fast. Other places, there's just going to be a big loss to the world as a whole, and to the contributions that they've really been making. Worldwide access to an unprecedented variety of products and services. My 61-inch TV, among other things. If we had a much smaller population, we wouldn't be getting so many products and services available to us. Easy, quick, and inexpensive travel worldwide. I just been looking back at the past few years. We've been traveling, my wife and I have been traveling a distance equal to going around the world, I think, every year for the past several years. And it's amazingly inexpensive to fly, at least, and it's just astounding. And part of the reason we're able to do that is once again because of the high populations that have developed the infrastructure, the airplanes, everything necessary for that to happen, and localities for us to visit that are interesting because there are people there. There have been gigantic leaps in scientific knowledge and technology in all fields over the past few decades, accelerating, according to Ray Kurzweil, and I agree with him. There again, I think a part of that has been the fact that there's been a growing number of technically and scientifically educated people. We've created many revolutionary capabilities, increase longevity, improve the quality of life, increase longevity a whole lot, Frank, and as I'm sure you're aware of that. And we can make more advances faster with more people. Not necessarily, I think there's some level you have to be at, but to think a dramatic reduction is going to somehow improve the world, I don't necessarily agree with that. And the last one I'll note is that humans uniquely can redesign ourselves and our environment. This is unique within our own solar system and so far as we know in our universe. This ability is accelerating rapidly with advances in genetic engineering and AI, and we'll be seeing a bit more of that in my presentation. Now, I'm a technologist and I consider myself a futurist, and to me that's great and a reason to proceed and to have the following generations to succeed. I don't know if that works for anybody else, but maybe that would be part of a tellus. So ways to reverse the decline. So I'm just throwing these out. I don't know if any of them would work, but here are just some thoughts. Pro-natalist government policies, financial incentives to have more kids, which we've heard doesn't work, but I think we're going to have to do, and hopefully that with other things will eventually help, result in it. Promote larger families, and I mean not just giving them money, but in education and indoctrination, I call it too. Try to get society to be more accepting of larger families, especially since a lot of people are not having any kids at all. We're going to need larger families in order to overcome that and win them. Facilitate housing development. I live in Oxnard, and it seems most of Oxnard is strawberry fields. To me, Oxnard is the world's best climate. It turns out these strawberry fields, they're not allowed to develop on them. They can't develop housing on them because of a vote of the populace. It says we want strawberry fields there. We don't want people there. I think that's a crime against humanity. That's a strawberryist position, and I am a humanist. So housing, we really do need to make more housing available at a lower cost. Facilitate all pair immigration. I think immigration is a huge advantage that we have in the U.S. that we're able to assimilate people from other countries, and we ought to make it easier in general. We're going to need those immigrants in order to fill the declining population that we're having because of our own unwillingness to have kids. So we need that, but in particular, something that might help us have our own people have more kids is if there's a way to get help from overseas immigrants and then let them become citizens. So there's an idea. And then education and indoctrination have the government push the idea that we need to have more kids. Whether any of that would work, I don't know. I think one thing I've noticed is my daughter, for example, has moved to remote work and she wants to have kids. We know that that's going to be of enormous benefit to us. The ideas like that, things that would help families be able to accommodate remote work, a greater role for grandparents. I've been thinking of communitarian society to make it more of a shared burden. I thought of kibbutzes in Israel, for example. The Mormons have more of a communitarian system where they help each other out. I think that's admirable. Maybe there's something we could get from that. I was thinking communes in Russia, but that might not be a good thing to talk about. So, what's interesting is everybody has ideas about that. But I think that what's important then to kind of search for a meaning in life is to develop some kind of pro-natalist belief structure or culture or tellus that fosters higher or lower fertility rates actually as appropriate to reach a sustainable target population size. So maybe it needs to be pro-natalist now and then anti-natalist one if for some reason we overshoot the bar. Something to think about. And then finally, technology. I've got some ideas about technology, ways that technology can help. And I'm a technologist and a futurist, so we'll see what you think of these. Some of them are a bit unusual, so we'll see what you think of it. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what I call super intelligent baby development, postnatal baby development. So I divide things between prenatal development, which is conception, gestation, and then postnatal after birth. So here's what we can do about postnatal development. And my thinking there is relatively straightforward. We have robo-nannies. Now, it turns out that there's a lot of active development going on right now on humanoid robots, and they're expected to become commercially available by the end of this year. So that problem is very actively being worked on right now. There's also work being done on AI tutors by, among others, Sol Khan of Khan Academy. So that's an AI tutor. And you combining those two together, I think there's a lot that can be done. But that's all I'm going to say about postnatal baby development because I've got a lot more to say about prenatal development. So prenatal development is conception and gestation. So what are new ways of going about looking at that? So we'll go over to that. So for prenatal development, I asked myself, what would Elon do? Now, once again, I'm an Elon hater, but I admire what he did with Tesla and SpaceX. And what he did is he looked at the existing way things are done in the space industry and in the car industry. In the case of SpaceX, he noted that there really hadn't been any developments of rocket vehicles for the past 60 years, with the initial development of things like the Atlas and the Titan launch vehicles. They just kept doing the same thing, making minor modifications. In the meantime, a lot of new materials had come out and new ways of thinking, new capabilities like GPS, ways of controlling and potentially landing rockets fairly easily. And so he took advantage of all that when he built SpaceX. He rethought everything from the ground up. He threw out everything that the previous rocket companies were doing. He started from scratch and thought about everything from scratch and questioned every requirement they had, every way they did things, and came up with a fundamentally different approach where he was going to launch rockets and recover them and reuse them. He's been very successful at that by taking a new approach. And with Tesla, he was also successful. He looked at all the car companies using all these internal combustion engines and decided, well, I'm just going to try an electric vehicle instead. And it actually makes things a lot simpler, and eventually it should be cheaper to be doing it that way. And he rethought the whole business. He didn't want to work for dealers. He decided it would be more cost effective and better for him to just sell them directly. And he made a lot of other assumptions that were just threw all the assumptions that they had made out the window. So I thought, well, okay, well, with prenatal baby development, what would happen if we did things completely differently? Because right now, the way we do it is a couple has sex and their sperm and eggs are combined and you get a random combination of genes coming out of that and some inherited mutations and whatever new mutations might be appearing. And it takes 9 months and there's all kinds of hassles and problems with women during the maternity process. Maybe there's new technology we can use that can do everything completely differently. So that's what we're going to look at here. So what would the requirements be? Now, once again, I'm a system architect from JPL. So the first thing I do when I start looking at new projects, I try to think of what are the requirements. So I took my requirements from the South Korean woman. No sex with men, no giving birth, no dating men, and no marriage with men. And I threw in a couple more. Avoid genetic risks. And also remove the biological clock. And these all cause big problems. So we'll see. I'm going to show you my solution and see if you agree with me that I've met those requirements. I actually go way beyond those requirements. So I'll show you what I'm proposing. So this is super intelligent conception. We construct whole human genomes from scratch with synthetic DNA. Now, synthetic DNA is a real thing. It's where you're not taking the DNA from an animal and somehow, or a human, and somehow replicating it. You're starting from scratch and creating DNA with chemicals to order. They're up to 10,000 base pairs now, but they're working. When I read the literature on it, their actually goal is to do this for whole human genomes, which would be 3 billion base pairs. So they have to scale up, but industry has a lot of experience scaling up with things like that. Just look at Silicon Valley. So I think it's a realistic thing, but I don't know details about this. By the way, I have not looked into this much, and I am not an expert in biology or in this field at all. Each human genome would be designed by artificial superintelligence using data from billions of human genomes and associated medical and personal data, as well as research results. In China, right now, they're collecting genomic information from 1 billion people in China. That's a goal, to actually get this kind of information, not just the medical information, but associated information that could be used in order to figure out what traits may be influenced by genes and to identify them. And these huge databases are being built, not just by China, incidentally, by a number of other countries are doing this sort of thing, to try to assemble databases that can be used by an AI to make optimal designs of DNA. Eventually, redesign the limbic system in the brain to make having children rewarding rather than sex. Part of the problem is that what's really rewarding is having sex, but not so much actually having the children. There is some reward to that. but the big bang that you get is from having sex. So we see if we can redesign the limbic system of the brain to make that more rewarding. And eventually, the sexual and reproductive and other extraneous organs will be removed. Now, you may recall that Seth Andrews at the last talk we had with the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara last month with Seth Andrews, who talked about all the extraneous things that are not necessary at all that are included in God's design or what the way things are done now in the human body with the current genomes. That's all open to playing around with. And so here's one he can add to his list. That once we have this process done, we can get rid of those organs. They cause problems too. I've got a prostate problem myself. I end up needing to urinate a lot at night. That's because of a large prostate. So a lot of guys, this audience may be familiar with that problem. Here's a way we would go about doing the super intelligent design of a new child. If you're a family, here's how you order your baby. You sit down at the computer like you're ordering from Amazon, and you'll have a menu of selections of things that you want. And you could decide to have your own genomes used in part or in whole for this process, but you don't actually have to deliver them. Well, that's in your medical records already. So we already have the information. We don't need you to actually contribute sperm or anything else. It's already known. But there'll be all kinds of other options, what kind of hair color you want, the skin, whatever, whether you want to use a branded genome like Taylor Swift or Arnold Schwarzenegger. They'll have their branded genome you can pay extra for to get somebody like them or have some of their traits. So that's how you go about. Customers could be they could be heterosexual or gay or single, an organization. Age and fertility don't matter. It doesn't matter at all because we're not getting anything from you physically. So the condition of your body has nothing to do with it. Customer genomic files can be used, but they're not required. Disease preventive genes would be included. Genes that cause disease would be left out. And there are a lot of those, and probably even sets of genes that are good and bad that interplay with each other. Those will be sorted out by the artificial intelligence that will help you decide what genes should be in the baby. And as I was noting, the branded and specialized genomes and genes will be available. Here are potential enhancements. And these, I didn't try to come up with new ones. This was simply a list put together by George Church of Harvard of potential of genes that actually do have specific improvements that have been identified. So you could actually do this just by adding genes using CRISPR. I'm not talking about using CRISPR, actually. This synthetic DNA is constructed in a different way. But these sorts of things would be available and far more. So the question I have for you now is, why would you gamble with your child's genes? You want to do it the old-fashioned way, which would be sexual reproduction, which is a random combination of genes from two people intermixed with inherited and new random mutations. Who would do that if you had a choice? When with a super intelligent design, you get diseases designed out. You have choices that you can make, all kinds of choices, huge number of choices, enhancements, no random genes, no mutations, no age limit, no infertility. I mean, this is a no-brainer. So that was all about conception. Now we're talking about the gestation period. So you've got an embryo, and we need to cook it for 9 months or have it grow for 9 months. We use an artificial womb for that. And that's a thing too. I just kind of dreamed this up, and then I did a search, and it turns out that a number of people are actually working on this, or venture capitalists doing it. I don't know much about it yet, but it is a real active target for a number of organizations now. And Neuralink would be optional. Now, once again, I'm not a fan of Elon, and I would never have anything from Elon in anything I buy. So I wouldn't do it, but there are plenty of competing. Now, maybe you don't know what Neuralink is. Neuralink is another Elon Musk company that wants to put man-machine connections in humans so that it can determine what you're thinking and it can control things in your head. And you might be able to use it to augment your brain in various ways. That's an active thing being worked on. So this is something that Ray Kurzweil talks about. So optional Neuralink or its equivalent from somebody else. And that could be put in during the gestation period. So where would all this be done? Well, in the baby factory, of course, with precision manufacturing standards, Six Sigma, ISO, mass production and automation would lower the number of personnel and costs. So it doesn't have to be near you. You don't need one in Santa Paula. The parents can just drive to Los Angeles and pick one up at the gigantic baby factory there. Because that's the most efficient way of doing it is to do them all together. I calculated you need about 90,000 of these in order to satisfy the needs of Los Angeles at their current birth rate. So let's talk about my original requirements then. No sex with men, no giving birth, no dating men, no marriage with men. This nails it. I meet all those requirements and the other ones that were given too. This would bring down, let me just say that the current cost of birthing I got from a report from Kaiser Family Foundation in 2022. It says that the health costs associated with pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum care average a total of $18,865. Now, that does not include such things like maternity clothing, lost time to the mother, going to appointments, all the nasty stuff that can happen while you're pregnant. You were never pregnant. You were never go through that process at all. So there's a significant savings there. So I'm saying I've tried to figure out what the amount of money that would be available to run a factory doing this. What I did is I said, figure, well, let's assume that you would charge $20,000 a baby for this. That's the whole amount of money that you have to pay. And that would include the gestation period of 9 months. Oh, we could try to get that gestation period down, try to get it down to maybe 3 or 4 months so you don't have to occupy a womb so long. We'll have to see if that's possible. Let's say it's 50,000 births a year per factory. 50,000 times $20,000 is $1 billion. So that's a $1 billion operation. Just using the funding that they're paying now. It's just would put a lot of doctors and obstetricians and nurses out of work. Okay, this shows the cost. So my final slide is on developing a humanist telos. And I just want to leave this up. It's maybe something we could talk about. There's a dodo bird. What is our long-term vision for humanity? How many humans should there be? What would our telos be? Is there some telos we can come up with, or some vision for the future or meaning for the future that would be attractive to people enough that they would do some more sacrifices to have more children? And how can we convince others of this telos? With that, I'll open it up to questions.
You've given us a lot of things to think about here, Gary. Anybody have any questions or comments?
So many questions. Well,
For
the whole
Gary?
concept, I believe, is a bit overpopulation is not a problem. It is a problem. Overconsumption, the pollution that's generated, the plastics in the ocean, there's a lot of things that technology is not doing to resolve the problems. They cause problems, but they don't always feel the need to address those problems. And so I think that overpopulation is a real problem. Just because you can plant more corn and take out more tropical jungles and things like that and grow more palm trees and things like that to do it, that's all increasing consumerism, but it's not making it for a better planet.
What would you say would be the right population? So now we're at 8 billion.
Maybe what we
that,
had,
or how would you even determine it?
well, I'll go back 100 years, and we now have automation we didn't have 100 years ago that could replace all the jobs, and everybody could have a better quality of life. You could use AI to provide better education in those populations. You could do that. You can use technology to improve the quality of life, but the constant consumerism benefits primarily the multinational billionaires who are scared to death that their financial situation is based on continual growth. That's what the model is for Wall Street. Grow, 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 grow. Put your money in and get more out. But it doesn't work for the general population. It only works for those that are investing in growth.
Well, I would agree completely with you that there, at some level, it's too much. And you have to keep it at a sustainable level. The question is, how do you establish that sustainable level? How do you get agreement on it? And then how do you control population so it doesn't go above or below? Right now, population is headed on a deep downward dive.
When it just starts destroying the quality of life and that sort of thing. That's why we have the Ventura County SOAR, Save Our Agricultural Resources, because we don't want to look like Orange County, where it's wall to wall carpet is of homes and people.
A strawberryist.
Well, where else are you going to get your strawberries?
There are plenty of places where you can have strawberries where you don't have the climate like we have.
And I want to live where they are.
Worse. So
I want to live where plants live.
All right, Marion, you have your hand raised.
When you mentioned the kibbutz, my aunt was a founder of a kibbutz, and it's true that they made it so that the parents didn't have to take as much care of their children. They were in children's homes. They did not sleep with their parents. They slept there. And the children, my cousins who were raised in that environment, have protested a lot about how they didn't have very nice relationships with the parents that other cultures had. And they were very much against that kind of making the parents have reduced responsibility so they could work. So when I saw the picture of the robot nanny, I did not think that I would want my children or grandchildren to be raised by some robot, or I, I don't even understand how that would work, or how an AI nanny would work, but this isn't going to be very well accepted. A lot of what you said was hard for me to accept. I grew up where we tried to have no more than 2 children because of the population, Ehrlich's population thing. And so it's really hard for me to start thinking of we should have more children. In fact, we used to think of the groups that had more children, like Catholics who didn't believe in birth control, and other groups who did not use contraception. Religious Jews didn't, and other groups. We thought of that as that was their way to try to get more power, to have more children. And so it's really hard for me to get excited about that. It just seems really yucky to me. Sorry. And the plural of kibbutz is kibbutzim. 1 kibbutz, 2 kibbutzim.
Thank you. Roger?
I think that the whole premise of this presentation is way off base. In fact, I'd call it false. You're talking about a population collapse. There is no population collapse predicted in the next 100 years, or actually about 80. But the whole premise here is that, my God, we've got to keep the population up. And that premise is simply wrong. And all of the benefits that you cited from an increased population are not a result of a higher population. It may be a result of any number of other factors. So I just reject the whole thing entirely. And I'd end by asking you a question. You've asked others, well, what's the ideal population level of the world? What's your answer to that question?
At this time, I'm thinking on the order of 8 billion. It might be 4 billion. I don't know. The way I define it now is the goal would be to find a level that people would agree is sustainable and to make it at that level.
You say, get us to a level where people agree. What makes you think that people will ever agree on that number?
Well, if we can agree on what the purpose of life is, for example.
No, that won't help.
To accomplish.
That won't help. Come on. If everybody had a purpose of life, how would that determine the proper population level? This whole thing is just ill-conceived to a fault, and I just can't buy any of it.
Thanks for your comments. Robert?
I just wanted to respond to that last comment. I think that there is a scientific answer about sustainable number for the planet. And so I think that that's almost by definition. I mean, if we're going to exist into the future and other species are going to exist into the future, then the number of humans should be the sustainable number of humans.
Any other thoughts or comments? Bruce?
So first, I want to thank Gary very much for this thoughtful, well-researched, and gathering of information independent of its political sourcing. That you had my attention only with that, right? And I'm with you on. I think I'm with everybody here on how appalled I am by Elon's more recent behavior, by J.D. Vance's more recent behavior, and all of that. But I've spent my whole life being on the overpopulation worry bandwagon. This is my first time joining you guys. I'm from Pennsylvania. And I got to tell you, I showed up here in order to get a primer on what there was to think about on this topic. And I am alarmed that I'm finding in the comments and in the questions that people are rejecting Gary out of hand just because we don't like to hear what he's saying. Well, most of us on this thing have gray hair. We're not going to be the ones that are being asked, first of all. And second of all, I found many of your arguments quite compelling, Gary. Frighteningly, possibly inevitable. So yeah, of course, the farther we project out, the more worrisome, the more tenuous our claims become. But to behave as if these things weren't worth talking about. I mean, y'all are in California. Have you driven east? Have you seen the land available? Have we watched over the last 100 years, let alone 250, how technology has been the very thing that has enabled us to spread out over what had been previously, if not uninhabitable lands, certainly lands that were more difficult to bring commerce to, right? Now we're not taking a month to get to a city once a year. Now we commute 2 hours and complain about it in the time it would have taken a horse a day to do. I mean, this is on a trajectory, is it not?
It's mind-bending because, yeah, we've spent the last 50 or more years worrying about overpopulation, and to hear about we've accomplished the goal, birth rates are declining, yay. Oh no, we may have gone too far and we may be heading for catastrophe. Or will other factors come in so that as the birth rates fall and there's more housing available and things become cheaper, will people start feeling more inclined to have kids, and that, and is it going to overall adjust over time? But
Yeah,
yeah,
this is
it's
complex and
shocking that it's
confusing.
the problem.
Yeah.
It's shocking to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for attending, and very much want to thank Gary for pulling this information together to challenge our assumption, thinkings, and beliefs. Thank you all, and see you next month.